All right, Ambassador John Bolton has held many hats, worn many hats, but he was the ambassador to the United Nations, and he was also the National Security Advisor for President Trump. Always a pleasure and an honor to talk to you, sir.
Great to be with you.
You have heard President Putin rail against the West, and you and I have followed President Putin for in excess of 20 years. I mean, this is not a recent hobby or mission or whatever you want to call it. So, calling our values satanic, threatening the West with nuclear weapons. I mean, you've met him many times, I think, if I can say many, quite a few, discussing when the U.S. was going to back out of the INF and arms negotiations. Is this the guy that you know?
Well, he never referred to me or the U.S. government as satanic in our conversations. And my conclusion, though, is this is primarily for domestic Russian political benefit. I think at this point, he obviously knows things in Ukraine have gone very badly. The Russian military's performance is embarrassing and really threatening at some level to Putin's own grasp of the Russian government. Nonetheless, there are a lot of people in Russia who believe, as Putin does, that the breakup of the Soviet Union was illegitimate, that Ukraine, other former republics are illegitimate or failed states. And so he's appealing to that base of support that he has, blaming the troubles Russia faces in Ukraine on the U.S., on the West, on our degenerate morality and the rest of it. So I think that's the audience that he's addressing. And I also think it shows how deep his political problems are.
Well, President Biden has called him in a most recent interview a rational actor. But I mean, he's also argued for regime change at one point, and then he kind of backpedaled, the White House backpedaled away from that. You've come out very boldly in your recent columns saying, indeed, America shouldn't be embarrassed about this discussion about regime change. It is something strategically that the U.S. should be pursuing right now.
No, that's right. It's very hard for me to imagine dealing with Putin's Russia as a government after this war is over, however it turns out, whenever that turns out to be. And I think that's the growing conclusion inside Russia as well. I'm not saying Putin is in danger of falling today, and I'm not saying it may not be a pretty messy process if at some point the military or intelligence services decide to take the first step. But this is not a stable government long-term. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had a Politburo that could say to Nikita Khrushchev, it's time for you to retire. They don't have a Politburo today. So it's a very unstable circumstance, and it's really, I think, deteriorating steadily unless there's some change on the battlefield in Ukraine, and I don't see what that would come from. I think Putin's situation continues to get worse.
How do you read the rhetoric, Ambassador Bolton, just not from President Putin, but some of the people around him? I mean, former President Medvedev, the Putin's mini-me who has sat in for him at different times. I mean, he rails against West and talks about attacking the West and completely annihilating Ukraine. And Patrushev, the former head of the FSB that you've met with personally a number of times in acting as the National Security Advisor. I mean, these are some pretty radical views. Have they changed, or do they spit this stuff out in your assessment just to please their boss? I mean, what is this?
No, I think they really believe it. As you say, Patrushev was my counterpart during my time as National Security Advisor, and I heard the Ukraine lecture on several occasions. I've heard it from Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister. I've heard it from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister.
What's the lecture?
Well, it's that Ukraine was illegitimately ripped out of Mother Russia, in effect, that it's a failed state, it's not a real government, it's corrupt, on and on and on. And the implication clearly is, given a choice, the people would vote to come back into the motherland. I think there's a zero chance of that happening today, but that was their perception before the invasion for many years. That's why I think it's a mistake for some in the West who call this Putin's war. It's really something that's more broadly felt within Russia, which is why it's a problem for us.
So you've seen some of this coming. Then not maybe an invasion in February, maybe you did, but you've seen this anger towards Ukraine and this belief that Ukraine should be serving Russia and be in Russia's sphere and under its influence, and they've used other terms to describe and belittle Ukraine.
Yes, exactly. And I think they have the same feeling with respect to Belarus, Moldova, the Caucasus republics, the Central Asian republics. Putin refers to these places as Russian. Now, he means it in the sense of the Russian Empire. He's not talking about recreating the Soviet Union, except maybe in a geographical sense. And I think this was evident years ago in 2005 when he made the famous statement about the breakup of the Soviet Union being the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I don't think we planned enough effectively for it, and the Trump administration trying to do that, given his views of Putin, was almost impossible. But the West as a whole has collectively failed here. Certainly, we failed to deter the invasion, which is our biggest mistake in recent years.
If we fail to deter the invasion, are we failing to deter a possible deployment of a tactical nuclear weapon by Russia as well? Have we met this in the way that you think we should in deterring the Russians? I mean, Biden has said things like, they better not do it. But, do you think, and apparently we've back-channeled and spelled out to them that there would be repercussions, but do you think the U.S. has been strong enough, and it's the U.S. that counts in this, that has dissuaded Russia from deploying a battlefield tactical nuclear weapon?
I don't think we have. I don't think we're close to that yet. I think the use of the nuclear weapon would be if Russian forces were in wholesale retreat. Now, we're not at that point where we may be close to it, but we're not at that point yet. But nonetheless, you can't wait until the last minute to put a policy of deterrence into place. And I think imprecations about bad things that would happen in general terms have failed to deter Putin repeatedly throughout the conflict. My own personal view is when we talk about holding Russia responsible, we ought to say, if we're going to levy responsibility, if a nuclear weapon is employed, we should levy it against the people who made the decision, meaning Vladimir Putin. And I think we've got to make it clear to him and to everybody around him that he would be signing a suicide note if he authorized the use of a tactical nuclear weapon.
What does that mean? I mean, how do you respond to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine? Are you saying that the U.S. should then respond with a nuclear weapon?
No, not with a nuclear weapon. I mean, I think there are a variety of things we could do, including providing more assistance to Ukraine, or even contemplating an attack on Russian forces in Ukraine or the Black Sea Fleet. But I think to make this clear to Putin that he is going to pay the consequences personally, to remind him that he is at the apex of the National Command Authority in Russia, and therefore in a time of war, which he launched in an unprovoked attack against Ukraine, he is a legitimate military target.
Ambassador Bolton, do you think that the Russians are looking for an off-ramp? There's been, suggestions by, for instance, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, recently, that maybe there could be a meeting. Biden said maybe there could be a meeting if it involved discussions about releasing an American detainee right now. Do you think that they're looking for a way out of this?
Well, I don't see enough evidence of it to think it's serious. Now, there are continuing conversations with Turkish President Erdogan. That always worries me, given Erdogan's behavior. That's a possibility. On the other hand, we have President Zelensky of Ukraine saying, I'm not meeting with Putin or his government. And indeed, part of the problem here is to have an off-ramp or any kind of ceasefire or anything beyond that. It takes two to tango. And Zelensky, now with his forces continuing to advance, taking back territory that Ukraine has lost since February the 24th, I think it would be very difficult for Zelensky to say at this point, I'm going to halt successful offensive operations to talk to Vladimir Putin. He would have his own political difficulties in Ukraine. So I'm afraid the conclusion, the kind of default position, is the war drags on. And this may be what Putin's strategy is, that the Europeans, facing a cold winter, facing shortages of gas, both for retail consumers, but also for European industry, that the strain at that point, given other economic difficulties the West as a whole has, that may be enough to break resolve in Europe.
when you look at what happened over the weekend with the Ukrainian attack on they haven't claimed responsibility, but I think we can safely say the Ukrainians attacked the Crimean bridge. The Ukrainians are saying that very soon Crimea itself, I mean, that may pale in comparison to what's to come, that Crimea itself will soon be in their crosshairs, and they may be, hitting some of the air bases in Crimea and home of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. Crimea will come under attack. It is a very emotional trigger for President Putin. It seems like we're about to go through an even more dangerous escalation.
Well, I think Putin has, in a way, done this to himself, having annexed Crimea in 2014, but now having annexed the other 4 provinces along the coast between Crimea and the Russian border up through the Donbass, because now he can say that the threat is to Russian territory from his perspective, but he's made it much bigger than the Crimea. And I think Ukrainians very well know how sensitive Crimea is for Russia. They don't really think it ever should have been a part of Ukraine, as it was a gratuitous transfer by Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s. It's obviously the major naval base and facilities for the Black Sea Fleet and others. So if the Ukrainians did increase pressure on Crimea, that would obviously call for a Russian response. I think Putin's problem is the Russian military has not demonstrated it's got the capability now to do something different than what it's done over the past 7 months. I must say, every time I think the Russians have reached the bottom of their performance, they do something worse. And I can't really say with any confidence that Putin has a second punch ready.
I think that's probably the best assessment that I've heard, and he's lacking a second punch. Ambassador John Bolton, always a privilege to talk to you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.